Okay, and you're here to join our webinar today, From Chaos to Control, Mastering Vendor Payments and Budgeting with Sage Intacct. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm your host, Amy Keenan, founder of the ISV Society. I'm going to launch a quick poll before we get started and while we're waiting for those to join us. So if you could please share your thoughts on what do you struggle with? Is it manual processes and paper checks? Is it spending too much time on manual budgeting in Excel, or is it both? Can you see notice the manual in here for both areas? We want to ditch the manual. So thank you so much for taking that poll. I appreciate it. It looks like one of you is half and the other is manual processes and paper checks. So both. So good thing you're here because you're going to learn how to get rid of those manual processes. Thank you for taking the poll. All right. Little agenda for today, intro and housekeeping. So basically this is being recorded. We will be sending the recording out to everybody so that you can share it with others in your organization. And of course, if you have to jump off early, and those that registered and weren't able to attend. So we will get that recording out to you in the next day or so. Then we'll dive into some pain points of budgeting and payments, bridging the gap, and then we're going to let REPAY come on and eliminate the paper chase and secure your payments and dynamic budgets. Follow up with automating and simplifying your budgeting. So let me just get to the next slide. So these are your speakers. As you can see them with me over here, we have Darren from REPAY. Very excited to have him join us today, as well as Zubin from Dynamic Budget. So thank you both for being here to present on these topics and helping people ditch those manual processes, get better at payments and budgeting, and get rid of those paper checks in Excel. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us. Thanks, Amy.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, before you each dive into your own slides, I would love for us to just talk about the pain points of budgeting and payments. And if you could just briefly touch upon that from your perspectives, that would be great. Darren, you want to start?
Yeah, sure. So, one of the things that we find when talking to clients, and specifically, I'm going to focus today on vendor payment solutions, is that there's still a lot of manual processes associated with typical AP. B2B AP is still fairly paper intensive, believe it or not, to where, more than 40%, somewhere around 45% of all US B2B payments are still made with paper check. There's still a lot of, paper process, reconciliation, et cetera, associated with that. So, we really focus on how do we help automate that process? How do we help electronify it? Specifically through our integration with Sage Intacct we're talking about here, but we have, integrations with various ERP systems. And one of the trends that we've seen that's been incredibly troublesome over the last couple of years is not just the manual process, but also the fraud risk, right? The security risk. And so I'm gonna really focus in today when I talk about that security risk and how companies are being tasked with solving for that problem and how we can help.
Awesome. And Zubin?
Okay. So with budgeting, typically most of the customers that we're working with are transitioning off of Excel. They may be working with another budgeting product that is become too expensive to work with or too cumbersome. But the majority of the customers are in Excel. Spoke with a customer yesterday that is juggling over 200 Excel workbooks. They send them out to the managers, have to compile them into groups. Then they force fit them into the Intacct template, and then they have to import. And it is a painful process. Just that process alone of collecting and juggling that many spreadsheets can be painful. But then the fact that you're working in Excel, unless you have properly worked and locked down the worksheets, the endpoint customers and users typically are incredibly gifted at breaking what you thought was protected. And you have the next fear is that they may have invented math formulas in Excel, and you as the budget administrator need to verify that they actually used appropriate formulas and calculated things as they expected. That burden is very daunting to a budget administrator. The thought of Excel, some people think, oh, it's freedom that we can do whatever we want and build whatever worksheet we want. From the administrator's perspective, we have to be responsible for whatever zaniness you attempted in your worksheets. So we're all about control, about standardization, about having a standardized set of templates that you can roll out and be live immediately. Some of the other pain points that we see with budgeting is that the typical argument is that if you're doing a top-down budget approach, corporate set these goals, they were unrealistic and I can't even meet them, and they're out of date by the time they set them in October. By the time we got to January, they weren't even relevant. Why do I have to be held to this unrealistic goal? What we're trying to do is push the process down to the endpoint managers, have them detail their budgets, run a monthly budget to actual variance report, and judge their performance against said marks. Did I spend this much in this month for that purpose? No. Well, is that a cost savings we can bank? Or is it just a timing issue that we're going to spend it later in the year? A lot of people will, not too many people are doing variance analysis on a regular cadence on a monthly basis. And if they do, where do they put those notes? It might be scribbled on a PowerPoint in a notebook someplace. There's usually no centralization of that information, and that information typically is not then resurfaced back when you go into your next forecasting or budget cycle. So we're giving them a method to collect that information and then take action upon that to take course corrections and improve that process. So that's where we see people stumble. A lot of people say, you know, it was so painful to generate the budget the first time that we can't even imagine forecasting mid-year. Well, if you could simplify the process, we have customers that are, one of our customers, in fact, does a baseline, pessimistic, optimistic, 3 versions of a forecast on a monthly basis for their 3 entities. So if you can imagine, you can't imagine doing it once, imagine doing it 9 times every month throughout the year. So we've simplified the process such that you could even consider doing something like that. So that's kind of a good starting point, Amy.
Perfect. I bet you could tell a lot of horror stories with budgeting.
Yeah.
All right, so now I'll turn the reins over to Darren, and I will let you share your screen.
Great. Okay. Okay, are you seeing my screen okay?
Not yet.
Okay, great. Let's see.
There we go.
Okay, great. Solve for the Zoom dynamic. We had transitioned to Teams. It's been a little while since I used Zoom, but I solved it, so we're okay. So, as I mentioned, I'm going to focus on some of the recent focus that we see of problems with AP, the trends that we're seeing, and that is, AP teams are being targeted, with very sophisticated attacks, which really wreaks havoc on businesses and impacts budgets, from budgeting from a prevention standpoint, as well as, God forbid, a fraud attack is successful, the impact it can have on an organization's finance. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk about a few different types of fraud types that we're seeing in vendor payments, some of the trends associated with those. I'm going to talk about some of the things that clients and customers should be doing in order to protect themselves against said fraud attacks, and then tie that up, talking about how REPAY can help solve for all of those things through our total pay solution. So one of the things that we're seeing is an increase in of ACH transactions, ACH fraud attempts. And this is really on a couple of different fronts, and I'm going to talk about some of those. But ACH payment fraud has been on the increase since COVID. One of the things that happened with COVID is really an acceleration of the digital, payment front. We've seen, I mentioned earlier that B2B payments are still in the neighborhood of 45% made via paper. COVID really helped accelerate that. Believe it or not, before COVID, that number was closer to 60%. And, a big part of that driver was, people were no longer going into offices to collect checks or, and so, digital payments were more in demand. And as those digital payments became more in demand, the increases of fraud attacks, were present because, now there was a new vulnerability. And, there's a couple of things there, when you look at ACH transactions and the susceptibility, and you'll notice the percentages here. The percentage of organizations subject to ACH fraud increased by 7% just from 21 to 22. And I can tell you with the banks that we work with, we have several partner banks that we work with, that number has increased even more so. I just don't have exact data for 23 and 24, but I can tell you we have seen an acceleration on that front. One of the things that we'll highlight, we use one of the tools that we use is virtual credit cards as one of the payment options for vendor payment automation. Virtual cards have seen reduce amount of attempted fraud than ACH, roughly 29% lower. Big reason for that is really in order to make payment with a virtual card, you've got to make payment to somebody who's a validated merchant that's been validated through one of the credit card networks in order to be able to process credit card payments. And typically there's some controls around single use amounts and those kind of things, as well as probably the big benefit there is you have arbitration procedures, dispute procedures to where, in the ACH world, if there's an ACH push that's done, you've got a couple of days perhaps to correct an error that might have been made. In the virtual card world or credit card world, you've got 45 to 60 days depending upon the timing of when a card's sent to be able to do some dispute things there. So there's a little bit more control, a little bit more fraud prevention built in, and so thus it's been a tool that we like to leverage as a prevention method. The other types of fraud types that I want to highlight, invoice spoofs. So this is where fraudsters. Technology has blessings and curse, right? Technology has enabled an average fraudster to be able to create very realistic looking invoices to replicate what would probably look like a very valid invoice from a valid vendor that a company does business with. It's really easy for a fraudster to create a fake invoice, change the banking information on the bottom of the invoice or somewhere on that invoice and send it into AP. And if the AP department doesn't have proper controls associated or processes associated with that, it's very easy for somebody to go into their system, change vendor banking information, and unknowingly send funds to a bad actor. So that's really common and increased fraud type that we've been seeing over the last couple of years. Obviously on those invoices, they can also change contact information. So when a payables, employee calls that number on the invoice, they're actually reaching somebody that's a bad actor. So it's hard to validate. Paper checks continue to be a concern in terms of fraud. When you look at, as fraudsters get more sophisticated, it's harder to detect certain scams. So the ability to forge, there might be public, information about somebody's signature, banking information being out in the public, allows people to create counterfeit checks. Checks can be stolen in the mail, washed, changed, the payee or even the amount. And all of those things have again been on the accelerant since the last couple of years. And you can see here the number, 63% of survey respondents to this JP Morgan survey stated they had faced fraudulent check activity. So it's obviously a big problem. Last year, there were a couple of stories published in the USA Today and CBS News. First of all, we talked about, 45% of businesses still make most of their B2B payments via check. Ironically, about 45% of all B2B payments are still made via check. So it's a problem, but there was a report put out actually by the US Postal Service saying, don't put checks in the mail. And it was referencing, some of these stories about the number of, mail fraud cases reported, mail carriers being robbed, and instances of fraud being up. So it's a big enough problem that the US Postal Service has great concerns about it. Another thing that we've seen and talked with some of our customers that they've experienced is they might implement an automated process by which invoices could be sent into a portal to be automatically loaded into an ERP system and facilitated for approval. Many times, many of these workflows don't accommodate for, hey, I can create an invoice for less than, call it $1,000, and it might go through a different approval flow to where there might be automatic payment issued without having to have, that really interrogated or approved. And, those small value payments can really add up. And so, it's possible for fraudsters to get access to those systems. Just a little bit of knowledge about how companies perform their AP can, make a company vulnerable to this type of action. So that's another, and then, compromised data. This is cyber attacks are hitting at alarming rates. You can open up any, news publication over the last 3 months, actually. And I saw a major news story just yesterday about a major company. I don't want to mention anybody by name, but it's costing them billions of dollars to where their data has been attacked. These fraudsters are holding their data ransom, demanding or holding their data hostage and demanding the ransom in order to release it. And so this is a major concern. And one thing of note here that we find and we advise our customers, one of your vulnerabilities is vendor banking information. It's really common for clients to say, well, I want to pay my vendors electronically, so I'm going to collect my vendor banking information, store that in my system so that I can make those electronic payments. That data becomes sensitive data, right? And somebody hacks into your system, gets access to that banking information, and that can be incredibly troublesome. So something to be defended against. Imposters. I actually read a news story a couple of months ago about a deep fake where they were actually able to voice mimic a CFO of a company, sending a message to a payables person in AI to imitate the CFO's voice. Talking to our own CFO, it's interesting. There's been a number of attacks that our own companies received where we'll get phishing, text messages and emails to where they're trying to imitate CFO in order to authorize movement of money. So all of these things, as we talk about all of these various fraud types, as you can see, they're getting more and more sophisticated and they're more and more troublesome. And if your company's been subject to these things, you know how troublesome it can be. And some of that, by the way, I wanted to highlight some of the psychological impact of fraud because, as companies are facing more and more of the fraud threat and having to defend against those things, when a company has been subject to fraud and fraud loss, the employees themselves oftentimes, feel like they could lose their job. They're embarrassed. There's, internal investigations oftentimes that are launched to make sure that it wasn't an inside job, all of those kind of things, which really just damages the work life of an accounts payable employee. And so it's another aspect that I think is worth considering. And so next, what I want to do is I want to talk about some of the things that companies should be doing in order to secure your vendor payments. So I'm going to drill into each one of these things. So first and foremost, we talked about, counterfeit invoices, bad invoices with bad banking data. A company needs to, take proper steps in order to protect themselves against sending money to an incorrect recipient. And part of that process can be, as you enroll a vendor in an ACH payment or other electronic payment method, if you're collecting banking information, you need to do something to validate that banking information, whether it's through validation of paper documentation that validates that information, or subscription to certain softwares that can do the same type of validation. But you want to protect that you're not just taking a potential bad actor's word for it and changing banking information without doing that validation. So that's one of the things that a company should be doing. Next, the other thing companies should consider is if you're going to send checks in particular, but actually making vendor payments, considering sequestering the funds outside of your normal operating bank account. If you're writing a check on your operating bank account where all of your funds exist, you've now exposed that banking information effectively to the public, right? It's out in the mail. It's it's out there with your routing and account number, and it's potential, the potential for somebody to counterfeit checks associated with that becomes a risk, because now all of the funds in that particular bank account are subject or vulnerable unless you're taking some other steps, which I'm going to talk about next, in the sense of positive pay. So positive pay, for those of you that are unfamiliar, is just the process of registering the checks that you're writing to vendors with your bank. There's a typical process of creating a positive pay file, sending it to the bank so that they can register the dollar amount with a check number and the account number. There is payee positive pay as well, so you can register a payee name as part of that. And those are great controls if you happen to be issuing checks to vendors. But a couple of notes here is that it can be expensive, right? Monthly banking fees to implement positive pay, as well as implementing the positive pay file, having employees that monitor, the creation of the positive pay file, the sending confirmation, all those kind of things are something that, needs to be addressed if you implement positive pay. We talked about the cyber attacks and the threat there. So it's necessary for you to secure your data. Vendor banking information we talked about, but let's say you're storing customer credit card numbers, those types of things, they need to be stored in a way that is PCI compliant and protected, encrypted, tokenized, et cetera. So, and again, this is an area where it can be cumbersome and expensive in order to implement those types of controls for the storage of payment data on your system. And then, last but not least, and there's other controls as well that I won't talk in much detail about, but it's important that there's proper permission control and separation of duties. You want to make sure that you as a company, you've implemented processes to, as money is leaving the business, that it has proper oversight, potential dual control, and and making sure you've got contingency plans for the, if somebody's out of the office, vacation, et cetera, for you don't want your operation to shut down just because you don't have the ability to approve. But it's never a good idea to put that responsibility on a single person. I happen to be very familiar with a company that a family member of mine works for, who, you know, thought they had these proper controls in place, but the exception happened, and ultimately they were subject to a $4.5 million loss, because there just wasn't the proper oversight there. So it's very important to make sure that these controls are put in place. So, you know, as you think about all of these controls, how to implement them, who in the organization manages, maintains those systems, et cetera, you need to think about, how do you budget for them? What's it going to cost you, both from an implementation standpoint as well as an ongoing basis? And so, you know, these are the things to think about when you're thinking about that cost. One, you know, it's generally incumbent upon people to implement these types of controls, as well as to manage, monitor, and maintain them. So there's typically headcount. You have to find out, you know, what resource in the organization is going to be responsible for those. Is there builds that you need to pay for from a technology standpoint to build your Nacha files for ACH payments, positive pay files, as well as the ongoing maintenance and monitoring of those things? What about, you know, reconciliation and monitoring of payments as they clear, make sure positive pay exceptions are monitored, et cetera. Cybersecurity, data storage, cyber insurances, premiums are outrageous these days, and the increase year over year in premiums are something that needs to be budgeted for and taken into account. And there's a number of other fees associated with, you know, banking fees and the like that you need to budget for, as well, as you think about these enhanced services in order to protect against fraud. So, you know, obviously, as we talk about all of these things, one of the things we obviously want to highlight is that REPAY, this is what we do, right? So vendor payments is what we do. And so when a client utilizes REPAY for vendor payment automation, all of these controls are inherent in the services that we offer with the software and services that we provide. You know, it done so in a turnkey fashion, so a company doesn't have to find additional resources or budget, you know, specifically for them. And then all of these things provided, you know, in a very simple and secure way via our integration with Sage Intacct. So allows companies literally overnight to go from what is usually a manual intensive paper process like we've talked about to 100% electronic, utilizing the tools of virtual cards, ACH, enhanced ACH. We're generally able to, you know, expedite time of payment, which in turn enhances vendor relationships, reduces reconciliation time and resources from our clients. And then, you know, also, you know, through the vendor relationships, we manage vendor relationships, making sure that we're securing payment data, making sure we're validating data, et cetera, and protecting our clients against those fraud risks. So, you know, one of the things, and we're also very unique in the sense that we offer both our integrated AP as well as our accounts receivable services as integrated with Sage Intacct. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and I'll go ahead and turn it.
Thank you, Darren. But, you know, some of those stats are kind of scary, and I feel like, you know, some of us will think, oh, that's never going to happen to me. But then you look at all of these stats and the risks of fraud and that one stat, JP Morgan repels 45 billion cyber attacks per day. I mean, that's like, it's just astronomical. Like, those numbers just don't like, you think that's not happening, but it is.
I gave a very similar, yeah, that's right, Amy. I gave a very similar presentation at Sage Transform. I started my session by asking the question, whose company has been subject or, you know, attempted payment fraud over the last year? And literally 100% of the hands in the audience went up. So every company we're encountering these days, when we talk about these risks of payment fraud, it's, if you haven't experienced them, you're going to, and so you better be thinking ahead about how you have proper controls in place.
Yeah, and the other thing that stood out to me was the AI. Now, now these cyber attackers and phishing attackers are using AI to be able to do it. And so it's like, we love AI, but now, no, do we really love AI?
That's right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
there's all
making
these
me
things you got to
think.
think about.
Yeah, thanks.
Just
Making me
another
think twice
level.
about. Yeah, making me think twice about having cloned my voice for the marketing demos with my
Yes.
virtual avatar.
That's right.
So
And
one thing that our cybersecurity consultants do to us is that we have internal testing, and on a monthly basis, they're sending us phishing attempts to test all of our staff and vary it up with various different in, kind of spoofing of different types of services, different types of offers. But there are services out there. If you're not in the habit of doing that, you might want to talk to your consultants about that.
definitely. Well, thank you, Darren. If you do have any questions, we will have time at the end for our Q&A. So feel free to put it in the Q&A or the chat and we will get to those. But with that, we'll hand it over now to Zubin from Dynamic Budgets to talk all about budgeting and getting rid of Excel. So Zubin, you're up.
All righty. Thank you. So I'm going to keep my PowerPoint slides to a bare minimum for you today. If I can get my mouse to cooperate here. Try this again. Be nice. Okay, this is my contact information, Zubin Gidwani at dynamicbudgets.com, and my phone number there or at the bottom of the screen. Dynamic Budgets is a budgeting tool that's been in the Microsoft Dynamics GP space for about the last 13 years, and we've been working with Intacct customers for about a year now. What we are focused on is primarily collecting and reporting and collecting your budgets. We do have a fair amount of reporting capabilities, but we're not necessarily trying to be the month-end reporting tool. We're not a CPM suite. We are a down and dirty budgeting tool. What we want to encourage is that you're going to budget, analyze your variances month over month, go into a reforecasting schedule. Ideally, you do a mid-year forecast so you can anticipate how the year might close out, and then you're getting ready for your next budget. So it's kind of a continuous improvement cycle. We have a number of different modules. We have budgeting, forecasting. We have quite a bit of reporting I'll allude to. There's a deep payroll module. We have 3 different payroll modules, allocations. And one of the key selling points is that we have a site license starting at $9,000 annual subscription, and we offer unlimited users. So whether you have 5 people in corporate using this or 500 people out in the field using this, we didn't want to discourage use by charging per user. So that's kind of the sales pitch. What I really want to focus on is the experience for the Intacct user. The biggest pain point for the administrator is that we have, when you're doing your budgets in Excel, at the end of the experience, you've got to get that data back into Intacct. And if anyone's been through that process, this form should look familiar. This is the template that you get from Intacct, and you've got your account, you've got your dimensions in here, and then off to the right, they give you 3 placeholders for your months. So you are, if you read in here, expected to then take month ended September so-and-so and stick that up into the budget title. And you've got to spell it correctly. And do you need the notes fields? Yes or no? Can I delete the notes fields if I'm not using them, or should I keep them? This is kind of a daunting process, just getting the template set up. Some of you are lucky enough to be spoon-fed your template from your Intacct consultants. Great on them, but we had generated this for ourselves, and we're trying to test, and we kept getting a failure message. So you know that you fill out this process, you import it in through the import screen in Intacct, and then you wait anywhere from 1 minute to maybe 10, 15 minutes to get your email response back from Intacct and whether it was successful or error. And it's not uncommon to get an error message that says reporting period not recognized. import failed. And we hit that error about 45 minutes in a row, kept in submitting, kept getting error messages. And it turns out that item and project ID, these two fields were in the wrong order and they wanted it flipped. But the error message was the reporting period was bad. So this process that we know that Intacct has is not friendly. By the way, you do have to delete row 2 with all the notes for it to actually work, and the extra row that usually comes in here at the end. So it's just a painful process that you're probably all familiar with. So let me show you the new world experience. If you were using dynamic budgets, you come to the tools menu, you choose export and export budget to ERP. This screen opens up and you would search on whichever budget you wanted to work with, the forecast or the budget. So I'm going to choose my budget and hit search. I populate the records on screen, and I could either choose to include all of my accounts, or maybe I just want to grab a subset of my accounts. So I'm going to grab the first 10 or 15 accounts in here, mark those as the ones that I want to send up. Those are the ones that I've modified. Maybe it's just one particular department that you're working with, or maybe you're just correcting the travel expenses. I could come down here and choose from my companies, choose from my entities, and choose whether I'm going to hit my budget or forecast. Now, a lot of your consultants have told you to create one single budget ID called budget, or one forecast called forecast. And it's a convenient way for the consultants to get out of report writing. If you have a single budget ID called budget, then they don't have to adjust the column sets in your reports in Intacct. It's an interesting strategy. I'm not a big fan of it because if you make a mistake and accidentally delete your budget in Intacct, you've now lost years of history. So to each their own. It's convenient on the report writing, but it does have a liability. I would prefer to see your customers set up budget with a year extension and adjust your reports, but it just depends on the nature of your operation. So we respect them both. Recognizing that there is a liability that you might lose data when you're doing your other activities in Intacct. Every time we export, we take a budget, an audit snapshot of what was in Intacct before we take our information out. So when I choose budget 2024, I can either delete the entire budget. This is just going to delete the year 2024 for the budget ID budget. If you had 23, 22, 21, all of that will remain intact. It's not going to intact. Ha ha ha. A little pun. But we're not going to hit those prior years when we issue a delete statement. We're only deleting from the year associated with your budget that you've chosen. So in here, I could either leave all of my other budgeted accounts. So I have these other accounts that I really don't want to update right now. I'm going to leave those alone. Or I could delete everything and just replace it with what I've got here. So when I hit the export button, we have a log file over here, just a little bit more informational for our purposes as we're still optimizing our routines. And right there, ideally you get 5 green checkboxes. Tells us that we took a snapshot of what Intacct looked like before we did any of our actions. We deleted everything out of the relevant accounts out of Intacct. We zeroed them out. Then we inserted the new data up there, and we took a snapshot after we did the insertions and the audit trail is completed. That's it. So search on the data you want to send up, choose the destination you want to send it to, give us an explanation. Well, we increased the revenues in Department 100 by 10%. Just so if you're doing repetitive uploads, it's nice to kind of tag those with whatever information you've done. Choose to either leave all the records intact and just update the ones you're sending, or delete it and just replace with what you've got on screen and hit the go button. That's the way your life should be. So a lot easier than that Excel import process. I'll give you a brief overview of what the tool does. The reason why we like to encourage people to get off of Excel and into any tool, whether ours or someone else's, is that you have a lot more control over here. So we've built a starting point for a budget. that shows a year of comparison to 23 actuals. We're trying to collect the 24 budget. Then I'm calculating a dollar variance and or a percentage variance from my original budget. And what I could do is in here, I could go through each one of my accounts and click into the account. And then I could itemize my expenses for that account. Maybe we wanted to do something simple and take the original budget and gross it up. Or maybe we wanted to start fresh, and I'm going to itemize my budgets. So they can come in here, delete the end user all by themselves, not the finance team, can be taught to delete or insert additional records. They can type in their various different expenses, contractors, one, etc., and tell us how much they're going to spend in which month for what purpose. Now, the big argument here is that, well, we've never itemized our budgets before. We don't collect those details. We just collect an annual number from the staff. Well, that's not very helpful to the organization, but imagine that the manager is new to a monthly budgeting, or they're new to the organization, just took over this department. Well, we have tools for them to learn about what's going on. If they click at the bottom half of the screen, you can see the 2019 actuals. My demo data is a little bit dated. If I click into that 4682, it shows me the individual transactions for that account. Now, this account was not terribly exciting with just a single posting of a recurring amount month over month. But imagine that we had a lot more transaction details to go after. Well, how do we surface that? I used to have to send out my Excel templates to the managers, and then I would do a data dump of all of our transactions for the corporation for the entire year into an Excel file and hand that off to them. But I have to break it up into individual pieces for each manager. Well, in our world, you would just tell the manager to go to reports, monthly transaction review. They could choose their department from the listing of the departments they have security clearance to see. I'm going to choose my admin New York. I choose my year and hit the search button. And this data over here comes back. It may have some formatting. Right now, I start with a laundry list of all of my accounts. And what I could do is grab one of my column headers, drag it up to the top of the screen, and sort by my individual accounts. So if I was curious as to how much I spent in repairs and maintenance, I could expand that and see all of the transactions related to vendor maintenance. If I was curious to see how much I'd spent with each of my vendors, maybe I'd just sort on my vendor names, vendor IDs, things like that. This happens to be an account that does not have any vendors, but this is the type of information that's available from our system. When you are done with your budget and you hit submit, if you try to leave a screen, by the way, you have unsaved changes, we prompt them. We've built the system for non-technical, non-financial users, those who are incredibly gifted at breaking Excel or getting lost in Excel. We've tried to make it dummy-proof such that they can't break anything. So if they forgot to hit the save button, I'm going to hit save or discard. I'm going to come back up to my account list and see where I'm at. One of the biggest pain points for managing the budget is, well, how do I consolidate this and roll it up and see where we're at? All the endpoint managers went into their own respective departments and entered their budgets, but now I have to collect all that data and consolidate it and report on it to see where we stand. Well, in our world, you come up to a report, you choose the entire 2024 budget and hit search. And if you want to see, instead of just a listing of all the accounts, if you want to see it consolidated, you turn on a reporting format. Here are my total revenues by month by the company, my total personnel costs, my total other expense, etc. Well, what if we wanted to see it from a department perspective? Okay, change the format over to department. You don't have to hit search again. Now I've got my individual departments. And if I double click down, I see my individual locations, and then I could drill down into the categories at that particular location. If I didn't want to keep manually traversing, I could just grab a big number here and expose all my accounts in their hierarchy. So that's the consolidation process for us, data entry process. doing your own research, trying to figure out where your money was spent in the prior year, even if you're a new manager inheriting this department. We're trying to make it easy for the users to interact with the system, easy for the administrators to manage the system, easy to get this data back into Intacct and go on with your lives. Most of our customers are able to cut out weeks of effort in the budget process, become much more efficient in how they do these budgets, and then the whole concept of issuing a forecast becomes much, much easier. In fact, we have a forecast builder tool which will jumpstart your effort. Most of our customers would come in, and since they did a detailed budget, they would use this tool and they would duplicate the original budget to create their forecast. So they copy all the line item details from their original budget. Maybe they copy all of their named employees in the payroll modules and carry that over and create a duplicate of the original budget to create that as the forecast. Other customers come in here and they say, you know what, we need to just come up with a simpler version of the world. We just want one row of data in every account, and we want to do a blend of actuals for the first half of the year and merge that with the budget for the second half of the year. Or maybe we want to do actuals for the first half of the year and an annualized average run rate from that point forward. So we can do a mix and match of year to date and budget, year to date and annualized, this year plus last year, this year plus blank. But we've got this forecast builder to jumpstart that process. So from an end user perspective, from an administrator's perspective, we spend a lot of time building in widgets to help you simplify the whole process such that you can get your job done and get on with your lives. All right. Well, thanks very much. I'm going to turn this back over to Amy.
Well, thank you, Zubin. Yes, I can see how it can save everyone tons of time and effort using a budgeting tool versus Excel. I don't know why people would want to use Excel after seeing that. I know I wouldn't want to. So if you do have any questions, again, please feel free to put them in the Q&A or chat so we can get to them before we wrap things up. And we do thank you again for joining us today. We'll give it a couple of seconds to see if anybody has any questions. Don't be shy, ask away. They're here to answer them for you.
You do have our contact information. If you have something that's a little bit more detailed or confidential that you want to discuss with either one of us, we're more than happy to take those conversations offline. But we also are more than willing to answer those questions today if you'd like to raise your hand.
And we will put all the contact information in the follow-up email with the link to the recording, so you also have that. Well, I guess they don't have any questions. You guys were just so thorough and just answered them all.
Darren, do you want to talk a little bit about typical onboarding experience for your customers and your platform?
Yeah, I appreciate you asking that, Zubin. We're especially as it relates to Intacct, but other ERPs that we have integrations with, like Dynamics BC, Acumatica, et cetera. We really get started with just taking over vendor, the vendor payment process. Best way that I can generally explain it is, if a company's ever implemented a third-party payroll company, what the payroll companies did for payroll is what we do for vendor payments, right? No longer are the days of having to go and ask your employees to fill out your direct deposit form and getting the employer, sort of involved in that kind of stuff. It's just you say, no, I'm now utilizing REPAY for my vendor payments. There's a couple of flags in Intacct that you designate REPAY as a payment method by the vendor. Those payments flow to us, and then we've already got an existing network of over 250,000 vendors that we're paying for our clients. So we've gone through the work of doing the vendor enablement, et cetera. If not, we do that work in real time, and so it's a matter of filling out an application, if you will, make sure we know who we're making payments for. We don't want to violate any money laundering laws. We don't want to end up on the wrong side of that law. But then, once we've done that validation and validation of the vendors and the enablement, we're ready to get started. So onboarding for us is generally, especially where we have an integration like Intacct, a matter of about a week. We get the client onboarded, and then their vendor payments are now automated and protected via the REPAY vendor payment automation process.
Yeah, on our side, there's a lot of confusion over what's happening with the with Intacct on the APIs. You do not need to have the developer API license for us. We are an outside application, a standalone application that sits outside of Intacct. But we have our own sender ID. So you're going to set up a web services user ID for dynamic budgets, and then we take over from there. We synchronize your data to a standalone Azure SQL database. We spin up a dedicated database for each one of our customers, and then we run synchronization processes to update that on a nightly basis, or we can give you a sync now button. But you don't have to worry about getting that developer key yourselves. We'll worry about that detail. Most of our customers for implementation, typically we're looking at about 10 hours for the average customer to go live with our systems. We typically compete against other solutions that will quote you 100 to 200 hours for setting up their data warehouses and for going through all the setups. We just scoff at that. You can't. I was the original frustrated customer that said, it cannot take that long, be that expensive, and then be, at the end of the day, be so complicated. I need to be able to teach marketing managers, maintenance managers, worse yet, events people to be able to interact with the system and get their budget details out of them. We just needed something that was bulletproof and easy to use. If you threw a really complex customer at us, usually like a healthcare customer, I'd quote you about 30 hours for implementation.
Wow.
But I simply can't imagine 100 hours for implementation. It's just night and day difference with our product.
I'm sure
It's very
people like
attractive.
that.
That's all that time savings allows you to go enjoy that beach behind you back there, Zubin. You can go enjoy that beach, and I'll go fight that traffic behind you.
Looks like foothills. Are you in Denver?
Salt Lake City area.
Oh yeah. All righty.
Awesome. Well, thank you for helping join us today, present on these amazing topics, help people understand what they could do with vendor payments and budgeting in Sage Intacct. And again, thank you all for attending our webinar. We truly do appreciate it. So with that, we will wrap things up, and stay tuned for an email with the recording and contact info. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Zubin.
Right.
Thanks, Darren.
Thanks very much. Have a great day, guys.
Thank
Bye.
you. Goodbye.